Hello everyone and welcome back. My name is Beth and today I'm going to be discussing Chapter 11 in Wired for Story by Lisa Crone. This is the next to last chapter and I'm a little sad to see this project come to an end, but I really appreciate the few of you that have stuck it through with me and I hope you're getting some great information out of it. For now, let's just get started. Chapter 11 is entitled Meanwhile, Back at the Ranch, and we, as always, have a cognitive and a story secret. The cognitive secret is the brain summons past memories to evaluate what's happening in the moment in order to make sense of it all. And the story secret is that foreshadowing, flashbacks, and subplots must instantly give readers insight into what's happening in the main storyline, even if the meaning shifts as the story unfolds. This chapter starts with another reference to Antonio Damasio, who is our neuroscientist we've been kind of following throughout this book. It says that in his book, Self Comes to Mind, Mr. Damasio speculates that it's thanks to the intersection of the self and memory that consciousness is able to bestow on us its ultimate gift, the ability to navigate the future in the seas of our imagination, guiding the self craft into a safe and productive harbor. We use the past as a yardstick against which we size up the present in order to make it to tomorrow. What's more, when we do this, it's our evaluation of the past that changes in light of what we've since learned. So memories are continually revised along with the meaning we derive from them so that in the future they'll be of even more use. So, what this means is that the memory of everything we've done, everything we've seen, everything we've read, and everything we've heard is not only affected by everything we've done after, but is also affected by what we are getting ready to do. That's a lot of change, guys. That's a lot of affecting going on every second of every day. So, what does that mean for writers? What it means is that we have to use things like flashbacks and subplots, but we have to use them very carefully in our stories because we don't want them to change everything, or maybe we do want them to change everything. But we have to make sure that we're using them in a way that will allow the reader to make up their mind to see things the way we want them to see things. Since the reader has to be aware of everything past, present, future, internal, and external that is going to be affecting our protagonist and their journey, we must make sure to include all of those things in the page. But how are we going to do that with a two-dimensional sheet of paper? We're going to use auxiliaries like subplots, like flashbacks, and internal dialogue. So let us get started with subplots. Subplots give stories depth, they give them meaning, and they give it resonance. But how are we supposed to include subplots that don't take over the story or disappear altogether? Basically, we have to pace the subplots so that they appear at the right times and they give just enough of a push to the story for the reader to want to continue and for them to continue to wonder about the subplot without taking over the main goal. Now, sometimes the subplot can be the most important thing in the chapter, but on the whole, it's not going to take over the entirety of the story. It is just going to give us some importance and a little bit more of an understanding about what is affecting our protagonist at the time. Our goal is to set the pace of each burst of intense conflict in the main storyline, each sudden sprint, each unexpected twist, fueled by the information and insight that's been building since the previous twist. And each time the conflict peaks, you want to back off a bit to give the reader time to take it in, process it, and speculate on its implications, which is where subplots come in. Readers accept that sometimes a specific story reason for a subplot isn't completely clear on the outset, but they trust the writer to fulfill the expectations and tell them why that subplot is there fairly quickly. And they eagerly begin trying to figure out what the subplot has to do with the story question and what its impact will be. So it actually had better have an impact. If you're going to include a subplot with some romance, it better have an impact on the main storyline. You can't just throw in a little kiss and not expect for the reader to be waiting on it to blow up at some point down the road in the story. Don't forget that subplots have their own story arc, and they often will build like a main storyline. Not only that, they will often mirror the actual storyline. So when something majorly horrible happens in the main storyline, a subplot will typically have something good happen so that our protagonist does not completely lose hope or faith, but they are still having to deal with the effects of both the good and the bad in the main storyline. Subplots often arc away from the main storyline and whisper things like, here's what you're wishing for. Are you sure it's what you really, really want? And here are 3 ways a subplot can do its job. Number 1, supply information that affects what's happening in the main storyline. Number 2, make the protagonist's quest that much harder. Or number 3, tell us something that deepens our understanding of the protagonist. And then it says, cue the subplot, key the flashback. Timing is the secret of everything. The question is, once you've vetted their viability, how do you know when exactly to slide in the flashback and slide them out of the main storyline without accidentally transforming this into a digression? Subplots and flashbacks sometimes give the reader a breather from the main storyline, and often following a strong scene, such as a major turning point, sudden revelation, or surprise twist. How do you gauge whether the information in a subplot or a flashback is relevant at that moment? And flashbacks can be actual entire subplots in and of themselves, so let's check them out. Sometimes people actually tell us not to include flashbacks at all, but what they mean is don't include poorly done flashbacks. Poorly done flashbacks will completely derail your story in a heartbeat. What you want to do with a flashback is make sure they're not yanking them completely out of the story. Make sure it has relevance that you can see immediately, that your reader can see immediately, and also has subplots included so that there is some suspense, possibly some suspicion, some new information that the reader needs to continue with the story in light of the flashback, giving us new information, letting us see things from a different perspective. Do not just give a flashback and derail the entire story by adding things that take us completely out of the story and we can't get back into it. That take us out of the story without giving us any way to get back into the main storyline. Often we will try to find the link between the 2 stories, i.e. the flashback and the original story. But as we go further into the flashback, we will begin to kind of lose our hold on the original story and start caring more about the characters in the flashback. And then when we are thrust back into the main story, we are confused and discombobulated, and we just don't want to get back into the story, or we gave up in the middle of the flashback because there's no reason for us to be reading it because we can't tell what it has to do with the main story. That's a bad deal. Now, what about backstory? Are backstories and flashbacks the same thing? Not really. Backstory is the same as a flashback, but with a different use. Because backstory is everything that happened before the story began. It's the raw material that we draw flashbacks from. However, a flashback is an actual scene complete with dialogue and action, stopping the main storyline. Weaving in backstory does not stop the main storyline. Weaving in backstory can be as simple as a snippet of a sentence, a fragment of memory of history, an attitude that is because of something that happened back in the day, and we don't have to do a complete flashback for that. It's evident in everything that the protagonist does, or the antagonist, or the side character, or the dog. It's evident in everything anybody does because backstory is who they are and why things are happening now, whereas a flashback is a complete scene from their history that tells us what actually happened. A flashback presses the story's pause button to show the backstory, demands the reader's full and complete attention, which means it had better have a clear reason for doing so at that very moment, lest it become another of those poorly placed, ill thought out flashbacks that make people think we should never have flashbacks. Now, I do have a flashback that is actually done a little differently that I want to talk about for a second. It's not in this book. It is a book that just came out in 2016 called Unhooked. I believe it is by Lisa Maxwell. And at the beginning of every chapter in Unhooked, there are a few italicized lines about somebody. You have no idea who it is. You don't know why you've got this story, but it is just a few little lines that kind of go along with that chapter. And then at the very end of the book, you find out that this has been a complete flashback the entire time, and it is the backstory for a main character. And you kind of have suspicions as you go along throughout the book, but really you don't know why you've got these. It's just an interesting little kind of side plot, not even a subplot, just a side plot that you then find out is a complete flashback. You've just learned all of the reasons why the character has been doing the things that he's done throughout the book that you didn't quite understand to begin with. And all of a sudden, this small little snippet of a story that's been worming its way through the back of your brain the whole time suddenly makes complete sense. You've got a light bulb go off above your head, and it's really, really well done. So if you want to have an example of how to weave in flashbacks, that is definitely a place to go. And a good story in and of itself. Okay, so the next heading is flashbacks and subplots, harnessing cause and effect timing. So there is a set of clear cause and effect rules that govern the seamless flitting back and forth between a flashback or subplot and the main storyline, and here they are. First, the only reason to go into a flashback is without making the information. The only reason to go into a flashback is that without the information it provides, what happens next won't make any sense. So there is a specific need or cause that triggers the flashback. Number two, the cause needs to be clear so we know from the second the flashback begins why we are actually going into a flashback and why we have to do it now. Number three, when the flashback ends, the information it provided must be immediately and necessarily affect how we see the story from that point on. Don't underestimate the damage even a short-lived logic glitch can inflict. So if what you're doing is not going to affect the story immediately, or the logic changes somehow, some way, some why, that's going to mess up the reader and the entire story. So you have to make sure that the logic behind everything you're doing makes complete and utter sense with your story. Now that I have said that, the next thing I want to talk about is the fact that as long as you make them believe that it can happen, there is absolutely nothing that your protagonist cannot do. If you have foreshadowed it, if you have done something that will allow your readers to believe without a doubt that your protagonist had this ability all along, they can fly, they can walk through walls, they can melt into little puddles, turn into gerbils, and skitter along the highway looking like pavement. As long as you have foreshadowed this in some way, your reader will go back and think, oh, now I understand. I knew they could do something like that. I had a suspicion. And that's your job, to foreshadow, to make sure that your reader can believe that your protagonist can do absolutely anything. Listen to your characters, who will be imploring you to give them a believable reason for every single thing they do, whether it be in a subplot, a flashback, or the main storyline. And now we reach the chapter 11 checkpoint. Number 1, do all your subplots affect the protagonist, either externally or internally, as he struggles with the story question? They don't want subplots just because they're interesting or provide a nice break. Your reader wants your subplot to affect the main story question. Number 2, when you leap into a subplot or flashback, can the reader sense why it is necessary at that very moment? You must make sure this logic is on the page and not just in your head. You want the reader to follow you willingly wherever you're going, whether or not you're in the main storyline. Number 3, when returning to the main storyline, will your reader see things with new eyes from that moment on? If you have gone into the subplot, a flashback, etc., you want them to come back to the main storyline feeling as though she has a new insight that gives them the inside track on what is going on with your protagonist. Number 4, when the protagonist does something out of character, has it been foreshadowed? Make sure you've given the reader solid tells along the way so her reaction will be aha rather than nuh-uh, give me a break. And finally, number 5, have you given your reader enough information to understand what's happening so that nothing a character does or says leaves her wondering if she missed something? That's a big one. You don't want your reader to be flipping back throughout the book trying to find somewhere where it gives you a hint that your character is going to be doing something crazy like that, whatever that is. So that is the end of chapter 11. We've got one more to go. Thank you guys for sticking with me. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will talk to you guys again soon. Bye.